For us in this year's budget was do not lose any programs, because once a program goes away, you need to reauthorize it. I mean, you can't just, and you lose the staff, you lose the infrastructure, you lose everything. If your funding is cut but your program stays intact, at least you can try to come back again. So the goal was don't lose the program structures, and if there are cuts, make sure they're not cuts that are going to directly affect consumers. So that's what we got out of the conference committee. And then we went to the governor's desk. And everybody knows what happens with the governor's blue pencil. $1 billion in line item vetoes, vindictive, nasty cuts, where he eliminated programs for no good reason. $1 million a year out of the Black Infant Health Program. This is a program that helps the lowest income families, young teenage parents who are not otherwise going to be good parents, who need to stay in school. They need to have, fathers need to be given ways to get jobs, to reconnect with their kids. It's the best example of how you leverage the resources of the public sector to support families, to keep families intact and increase their earnings. To cut that did nothing to solve California's budget deficit. It was just a mean, nasty cut to the most vulnerable. And you can go through the line, the cuts to senior programs, and of course the biggest one was the elimination of the stage 3 child care, $246 million, totally eliminated this program that helps women who have worked their way off welfare. They went through the program, they went to school, they're working, they're paying for child care, but child care costs $1,000 a month for a 4-year-old. A woman who is just working her way up the ladder is not able to both pay that and pay rent. There have been studies that show that child care costs come to more than food and rent for some families. So it's totally, that line item veto says to people in California, if you're born poor, to hell with you, you can stay poor. So the moral issue that unites us is this question of who is worthy for spending from the public purse? And this is the fight that I think we're still engaged in. This question over who is worthy. And the trick for us is always, you get your public polling and you do your focus grouping. And we know there's a basic rule of thumb with organizing. It's the rule of threes. You've got the people who are with you, and that's your base. And you always want to make sure your base is with you, but in order to win, there's then the squishy middle, the undecided voters, the independents, the folks who haven't made up their mind. You have to talk to them in a way that can persuade them, because you need them to win. And then the other third is the folks who, they don't agree with you, they're never going to agree with you, and they're always going to vote against you. So the challenge when you're doing a statewide public policy campaign is always, you talk one way to your base, like I just talked, but that kind of talk doesn't necessarily win you your middle. And so I think the base, like if we're talking about IHSS, it probably drives you crazy to hear some of the stuff people say, like, you know, the idea that there can be savings, administrative savings, or, you know, the $65 million cut through the stakeholder process. It drives you crazy because you know that money isn't there, right? But then there's someone like me that says, okay, but in order to win this campaign, we've got to be able to talk in a way that these squishy, there are people who they get their news from the TV news, they have no connection to IHSS. When the governor and other people say over and over again, fraud, 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 they believe it. So how do we reach them? So for next year, there's this untackled question of whether your issue is IHSS and Medi-Cal, or whether it's senior programs, or whether it's CalWORKs and childcare. How do we talk about the public sector and the work that it does and the Health and Human Services safety net in a way that establishes that that people who don't work also, that some people do deserve, that some of us deserve these programs. I am ostensibly a middle-class, middle-aged woman. I've worked in the nonprofit sector all my life. Will I be able to retire at 65 off of Social Security? Will I be poor when I'm old? I have no children. Who's going to take care of me when I'm old? These issues matter to me. How can we connect with other women in their 30s and 40s who think they're middle class, who may not be thinking about the fact that they have a higher statistical probability of having a disability before they die and ending up needing IHSS and Medi-Cal because they don't feel it now? How do we talk to them, and how do we talk to them in a way that isn't just about a program, but is about this broader issue of what kind of society do we want to live in, and what do we think our tax dollars should go for? And how do we make people angry about the fact that we have a budget system that makes it easier to give billion-dollar tax breaks to Genentech and Intel than it is to create systems of care for seniors and people with disabilities? That is the piece of work that we have to do. And when the budget fight starts to get hot and heavy around March of next year is not the time to try to do it, because stuff has got to be in place and moving by then. So here's the timeline moving forward. The governor, okay, so both Brown and Whitman, we will have a new governor next year, and new politicians like to do new things. Both Brown and Whitman have said, I'm gonna start early. I'm gonna start as soon as I get elected. So November 3rd, we have a new governor. January 10th, Constitution requires them to introduce a proposed budget. So there is some real work to do so that in that period between November 3rd and January 10th, the budget that gets produced by that new governor is a decent starting place. We need to have a governor, when that budget comes out January 10th, that governor had better understand what IHSS does. That governor had better understand who gets on IHSS, who needs it, who doesn't get it because it's got such a long and difficult eligibility process. Same for Medi-Cal, same for CalWORKs. And we have to have an electorate, the people who get their news from the television and to a lesser extent newspapers, who understand what these programs are and that these programs are for them in a way that they don't understand now. People have probably know, but let me just share with you one of the facts that becomes a guiding star when you're planning an advocacy program. The electorate, the people who actually vote in California, are older, richer, and whiter than the population of California as a whole. Only something like 60% of those who are eligible to register to vote are even registered. And only something like 60% of the people who are registered actually end up going to the polls and voting every year. And so what that means is that as we look around the room, who we see in this room, imagine that out of every table, only 3 out of 4 of you are actually going to register to vote. And then only, out of that group, only 2 of you are actually going to vote. And imagine that it's the oldest, the richest, and the whitest of those of you at each table who are going to vote. So you get an electorate that doesn't really represent California. So, and those people, so we have to, when we talk, we have to be talking to those people. as well as doing the work to make sure that all the rest of us are voting. But that does skew the conversation, and it does explain why we get some of these really whacked outcomes on policy issues. So timing, okay, so between November 3rd and January 10th, what can we do to shape the budget that gets produced by either Jerry Brown or Meg Whitman on January 10th? Meg Whitman says that she's going to eliminate 40,000 jobs. She says she's going to crack down on that there's a lot of fraud in CalWorks, in IHSS. The leaders of her party in the legislature have said that by definition, to have home care provided by a family member is inherently suspicious. What could we possibly do? And of course, we've got the whole Thanksgiving, Christmas season coming, right? So the media has moved on. The budget's done. So I don't know the answer to this. This is not a trick question that I know the answer to. What I know is that on November 19th, the field team for the HHS network is going to have an all-day meeting and try to figure some of this out. And also some of the lobbyist folks are going to be meeting in Sacramento next week and trying to figure some of this out. Who's going to be on the transition team for Whitman and Brown? How do we get their ear? Who are they going to put who are they going to put in charge at the Department of Health and Human Services? So please don't assume that the budget work is done, because there will be some quiet period, but then there will be some real action. And we know that we'll always be doing an action on January 10th when the budget gets announced. There will be public actions, and we'll want to be able to get the word out to all of you and have, whether it's in Sacramento or Los Angeles or the Bay Area or Eureka or Fresno or Bakersfield, we need to have people who can come out, do a press conference, do a rally, have the signs that say, don't cut Health and Human Services. And then we have that whole period between January 10th and May where, and again, this is where Whitman and Brown say it's going to be much more intense, where what's supposed to be happening is the legislature is supposed to be having bipartisan negotiations. But of course we know that that doesn't really happen anymore. Are people familiar with the no tax pledge, the Republican no tax pledge? And are people familiar with the 2/3 rule for the budget and Prop 25 that would return us to a majority vote budget? So we've been doing some studying. So California is one of only 3 states that requires 2/3 of the legislature to approve its budget. And the other 2 are really tiny states, Rhode Island and Arkansas. Those states are very tiny and they're very homogenous and they have part-time legislatures. But every other state, 47 other states, do a majority vote budget. And it turns out, if you look back at history, this happened in the 1930s. I think it was 1938 that with Hiram Johnson, when we started to do all these referendums and we created this 2/3 rule. And it turns out that it actually worked okay until, and budgets were passed on time until 1991. Well, what happened in 1991? The Gingrich contract with America and the no tax pledge. And ever since 1991 and the no tax pledge, the ability to have any kind of bipartisan negotiations on a budget fell apart, because if one side says revenues are not part of the conversation, then all you can ever do is cut. So you can't have a conversation about what does the state need, you can only have a conversation about what do we cut. So please vote yes on Prop 25. Please vote yes on Prop 24 to roll back the corporate tax breaks that were done in the dead of night in secret in last year's budget, when they cut hundreds of millions of dollars from programs for health and human services, and at the same time gave giant tax breaks to corporations.